you never really know what something is going to be like until you start doing it. And the exciting part of living with principles, in surrender to the way that reality works, like, things get more exciting. That's been my experience, especially in groups. When you've got a group of people that is like working with a coherent set of principles, like, several years ago, I came to the realization that a lot of the planning that I had done in my life hadn't worked out that well. And it was really kind of obvious in an instant that that was the case. And I didn't try to convince myself that it had anymore beyond that point. I had been trying to convince myself that my ability to plan was pretty good up until this moment. And then it was just sort of like a series of events, a series of days, one after the other, where it became clear to me that I wasn't that great of a planner, among other things that became clear in that moment. But one of the things that became very clear was that I wasn't that great of a planner, and that it was kind of absurd that anybody could suggest that they were that great of a planner in terms of having very specific goals in mind for what I wanted to happen, or for, in somebody else's case, what they wanted to happen, and actually being a trustworthy person to bring that plan to fruition. And I think as I reflected on this in time, the urge to plan kept coming back, because we're often asking one another, what are your plans? And it became really evident to me that, we keep each other in this sort of like social matrix where there's like, an expectation that a kid coming out of high school should know what they're going to do, or that, a newlywed couple or a couple that just bought a home or moved in together knows how it's going to go. Or if you're starting an organization, excuse me, if you're starting an organization, which is one of the things that I spent most of my 20s doing, starting and then building an organization. There's an expectation, I think, that the founder puts on themselves or the people around them that like we should know what this organization does. And I certainly see people out there who are like very specific and are addressing a very specific need in the world and have a certain sense of clarity at an early age of what it is that they're about and what they're going to do. But I think for many of us, especially at this moment in time, and I think this is a special moment in time, it's very difficult to make plans with great specificity around what the outcomes will be. The reasons for this, I think, are relatively obvious. We can look at no further than the cost of living and see that with prices increasing, like I don't actually know that I'm going to be able to afford what I can now afford in a year's time. And there's a lot of instability connected to that, because of course it's not just me that's facing that issue, or not just you that's facing that issue, but kind of everybody in your life that's not living with great means at this point. So I say this as a point of consideration, hopefully because it's something that you can also relate to. And I also say it as a way into the conversation about like, what are we doing on this channel? What am I doing in this channel? What is my plan for this channel? And I want to talk about that a bit, because I am taking both the initiative to make an offering for you to consider, following along, subscribing, taking part in the process of what I'm doing here. and also with the recognition that like, I have kind of a loose plan, but it might not go as planned. So I'm like a wee bit reluctant to share too much at this point. So I'll talk a bit first before I jump into that at kind of the way I have been handling it for the last few years, having this personal realization that a lot of the planning in my own life hadn't worked out as planned. And that probably more troublesome than that is that my insistence that it ought to work out created a lot of trouble in my life and my relationships that I am cautious of now because of my awareness of how, when things aren't going to plan and your ego is attached to planning, I'm more cautious of it now because that's a trap I don't want to get stuck in again. I don't want to get stuck in the trap of doing things or working extra hard or pushing and pushing and pushing when it's clear that something is not meant to happen, that it can't happen, and that it's really only the service of my ego that would benefit from it happening. There's something in this culture that is almost endemic in the sense of we don't live in a culture of surrender. We don't live in a culture of acceptance. And we don't live in a culture where when someone realizes that something isn't going to work out, we celebrate that person for dropping out of school, for quitting a job, for leaving a bad relationship. I think sometimes we congratulate people for leaving bad relationships when it's very obvious, but when it's not obvious, that's not necessarily the case. And not necessarily even a bad relationship, but just the relationship that has come to its natural end. I remember I was in a Bachelor of Education program or teacher's college about 12, 13 years ago. And I remember I did one semester and I realized that becoming a teacher in the public school system in Nova Scotia wasn't the path I wanted to follow. It wasn't the path for me. There was other things that I wanted to do with my time. I wanted to study educational philosophy, the art and science of teaching, and I wanted to understand how people actually learn. And it was a real disappointment to me that scarcely got covered in the Bachelor of Education program I was in. So I went in another direction to investigate teaching and learning. And I ran into a friend that I'd gone to high school with at a bar one night shortly after I had this realization or had made this decision to quit. And she was like, how's teacher's college going? Or how's the BED program going? And I told her, well, I just decided to drop out. And she was like, congratulations, like, way to go. And she said, we don't congratulate people enough for making decisions that are right for them. And I'm so happy for you. And that was the only version of that I got, or that was the only time anybody reacted in that way. And I was like, it made me feel on the moon when she said that, because it was like, thank you, somebody who gets it, that it's like, just because you start something doesn't mean you ought to finish it. And in the last couple of years, I've actually tried to start a media project. When I left Springtide, the organization I was running for close to a decade, I left Springtide the first year of the pandemic, so fall 2020. And when I left, I just had all kinds of ambition to work on a local journalism project, a local media project. And so much ambition that I did it once, and then I tried to do it once, don't like using that word in my current vocabulary, but it was the effort that I gave it then. It was a try. And the first time I tried, I just had this inner resistance that, and I would say at that point, it was mostly a resistance that I probably ought to have pushed through. And I think I would have learned something about it and learned something about myself. And then some stuff came up in my life that I had to deal with. So then a year later, I tried it again. Almost exactly a year later. And that time I did put a relatively solid effort into it and got about as far, like 6 episodes into a podcast, and then decided to back away from it. Both cases, I could have done a better job at communicating with the audience. So I say that knowing that maybe some of you who were part of that audience are listening now, and I regret not being more open with how it didn't go. And I guess for this video, I'll be sharing some of the lessons I learned. So perhaps that will be meaningful to some of you. So the second time I did it, I stopped doing it, but it was with a far more, I guess, a better reason. I wasn't afraid of the inner resistance at that point, because I did have it and I worked through it. But what I realized as I started making this podcast for covering local issues, local journalism issues, or I was practicing local journalism on local issues is probably the clearer way to say that, is that as I was producing it, I realized I don't want to make this. Like, this isn't the thing that I'm here to make. This isn't if I'm going to be entrepreneurial at something, if I'm going to risk failing at something, I don't want it to be this, because you don't get an infinite number of kicks at that can, or at least that's how I was feeling at that time. And, I don't know if that's entirely true, but that was where I was at, that I didn't want to, I didn't see the kind of change that I was interested in coming about from the kind of coverage that I was giving the issues as a one-man shop. And I realized that I love in-depth long-form journalism. And that if I was going to do in-depth long-form journalism on something, an example would be glyphosate spraying in Nova Scotia. I did probably the one episode that I was most convicted about, where it's like, there's a story that needs to be told here. There's depth that needs to be explored here. And there's real disagreement on values between the people who are disagreeing on this issue, whether that's activists who are camping out in forests and that are set to be sprayed, knowing that they can't spray if the activists are kind of visibly in the forest and protesting. Interviewed a guy who was like up in a tree for a couple of weeks in one of these forests. Fascinating issue. And I could go into depth right now on why it was fascinating for me. But it's like they're spraying weed killer from the helicopters over forests that are part of, the ecosystem that is attached to water. And, there's all kinds of data that says the risks are minimal to humans nearby. And courts are deciding in favor of the people who have demonstrated harms of this product being sprayed on, or exposure to this product in the form of cancers and other illnesses. And it's weed killer being sprayed from a helicopter. Like, we should have really good reasons for doing that. This was my perspective, but then I realized, like, to actually get people tending to this issue, to get people focused on this issue, to get people concerned enough that it's not just something that tickles their brain as they listen to their favorite local podcast, and like actually becomes something that we pay attention to. It just clicked for me that like, that's like a ton of work on one issue. And you could pour years of your life, and I spoke to people who had poured years of their lives into researching, advocating, and doing journalism on this issue. And that was clearly their work. And it was clear to me that it wasn't mine, that mine was in some other place. I started with a plan, and then in the execution of the plan was the learning about what I really wanted to do. And where I landed following that podcast or following that journalism experiment, after trying to rethink, well, how could we do it, was that, at least at that moment in time, I wasn't the person to carry that torch forward. And the continuation of the work that I had started in my mind when I started Springtide, the organization I was running prior to that, that might look very different than what Springtide looked like. It might not look political at all. And that I had inner work to do. I had other developmental work that I wanted to do before I was ready to do something in public again. And something I think that I guess has been a takeaway for me for that experience is that you never really know what something is going to be like until you start doing it. That you never really know how you're going to show up somewhere until you start showing up in that place. You never really know the challenges facing someone in that job that you think you could do better until it's actually you in that job. And that may sound hokey or trite, and it's absolutely true. Like, it's impossible to understand the experience and perspective of someone unless you are them. And I've had a lot of conversations with friends who have ambitions and inklings of things they'd like to do one day. And what seems to happen is we get focused on this idea of, well, I want it to be like this, and I want it to be like this, and I want it to be like this. And these are like all these pieces that we're carrying around in our plan. And whether that plan is on paper or just in your head doesn't really matter. It's a plan, and it's fake. And I say fake to mean like it's an illusion. It's a rough model of what you think is going to happen or what you think needs to happen in order for you to get the thing that you want, to be in the career that you want, to be the kind of entrepreneur or creative that you want to be. And the reality is, 3 steps into actually trying to move in the direction of that plan, a lot of what you thought up over here doesn't matter. And I can say this from the experience of the last 2 weeks of like posting videos on YouTube. And really my intentions have been like, I generally know the direction I want to move in. I can't describe it perfectly yet. If I had to describe it right now, this would be a good challenge for me. It's like, I want to help people evolve. I want to help people be their best creative selves. I want to help people connect with their values. I want to help people live from a place of truth. I want to help people walk on a path of the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of mastery of whatever it is that they know in their hearts they're here to do. And if they don't know what they're here to do, I want to help them figure it out. And if you asked me how to explain that 4 weeks ago, I would have said something way different. And if you look back to the very first video, you'll see something way different that, like, in my mind was moving in this direction. But it's in taking that step in this direction. You know, this is not like we're on a journey and like, I'm in Nova Scotia now, I want to be in Boston within a week. Everywhere I go between here and Boston, when I run into people, they're going to ask me, well, where are you going? I'm going to say, I'm going to Boston. It's going to be the same destination until I get to Boston. And then when I'm in Boston and people ask me, what are you doing in Boston? I'll have another answer and I'll tell them why I'm in Boston. But life planning is different. I think life planning, we have to rely on principles. And if you're on a path like the one I'm on, where the goal is to try and live in truth, then you can't necessarily use the same words today to articulate what it was that you articulated yesterday, because some things have shifted, but your principles have not. If they're good principles, you might add more principles. You might refine the way you communicate about your principles. But I think the value of principles is that they give you the ability to make decisions without necessarily knowing much about the context. I have become a fan of the Ramsey Show. I don't know if any of you watching or listening have watched the Ramsey Show or listened to it on podcast. I think how they describe it is, welcome to the Ramsey Show, where we help you make decisions about money, work, and relationships. And it's like a 30-year-old business, a 30-year-old radio show that's now a podcast and a YouTube show. And it's run by this sort of older Southern gentleman named Dave Ramsey, who has been doing this for 30 years. And he has a big company. I think there's something like 1,000 employees there. And he was talking about the challenges or the reality of running the business, Ramsey Enterprises, I think it's called. And he said, we have about 14 principles that guide all of our decisions. And that makes the work at Ramsey pretty boring, because when you've got good principles, all that you have to do when you show up to work in the morning is execute on those principles. New situations are arising every day. And when we encounter these new situations, we rely on our principles to guide us as to what we're going to do. So there's usually not much debate as to what we're going to do. All of the conversation is about how are we going to do it. And I think the flip side of that is that, if your principles are strong and coherent with one another, right? You can't have conflicting principles. They have to work together as part of sort of a piece of music, right? You can't have part of the band playing in one key and part of the band playing in another key. You can't make that really good. Right? They've got to be a coherent set of principles that you're working with. But the beauty of that, I think, is that you get to have a beautiful piece of music if you're coherent with one another, and you get to have a beautiful organization. And it's being in a building that's really well designed, or being in someone's home that's really well designed. And, when you need something, it's sort of that need has been anticipated for you. That's been my experience of being a part of really coherent group process, or really coherent, buildings are one that come to mind, or public spaces, really well designed, but they're designed with principles. They're designed with principles. And the exciting part of living with principles, and living with a set of principles that is sort of in surrender to the way that reality works, coherent with the way the larger reality works, physics, and maybe even metaphysics. Things get more exciting. That's been my experience, especially in groups, when you've got a group of people that is working with a coherent set of principles, because you know those principles, because you're sort of equally familiar with those principles. When things arise, it's sort of you don't necessarily even need to talk about them. It's just when you all know what's going to happen next, it's oh, well, because of our principles, we're moving in this direction. And you talk about it, but you don't necessarily have to talk about it. And people can correct one another. This is one of my favorite parts about working with principles. It's if people truly believe in the principles and are on board with it, and they haven't had their hand forced, but it's something that they've had the opportunity to opt into, correcting each other is like so easy. Like someone makes a mistake. I've probably made at least a dozen mistakes in the words I've chosen so far in this video. And if that were to happen in a group setting where we're working with coherent principles, someone corrects me, it's no big deal because I know they're coming from the principles that we're working with together. You know, we're not in disagreement on the principles, so that correction is easy to accept. My ego doesn't have to be involved in it. And vice versa. If I see something that, oh, that's not going to work, and it's generally equally tolerated, it's just not a thing. It doesn't become a hard, like in organizations where the principles are misaligned or absent, or there's no vision, or there's no coherence within the vision or principles of the organization. They're just word salad that gets, recycled every couple of years because someone 3 levels up said that that's what we had to do. Oh gosh, the arguments and debates are so petty. It's because you're still debating the principles. Every time something comes up, it's like, well, I think it should be this way. And then somebody genuinely disagrees with you and you have it out, but there's nothing to fall back on. When I was at Springtide, we did a project where we interviewed a series of, or like a bunch of former politicians. And we spoke with the former environment minister in one of the progressive conservative governments. And he had also been a church minister before, and then again after he served in politics. And in our interview with him, he said, there's politics in the church and there's politics in the legislature and the political party that I was a part of. But he said the politics of the church was so much easier to navigate because we had this book that we all agreed was our guide. He was talking about the Bible. He said there's nothing close to that in politics. Everything is on the table all the time. There's no principles to fall back on. All we have is this name of, progressive conservative. And at that point, it was really starting to lose its meaning. And I would argue probably still is. So that's the plan. There is no plan. The plan is, if you want to evolve, if you want to connect with people that are also interested in evolving, my hope is that that's what this channel grows into, is a place where we can connect. I'm here to share what I've learned on my path. And at the moment, I'm working on some more formal or I guess more prepared work should probably show up in video at some point. Really unpacking some concepts that deserve time and attention to how the information is ordered. The first thing that comes to mind is a set of videos on spiral dynamics that I'm interested in sharing with you. The spiral dynamics concept, I'm not going to explain it because it either means something to you or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then great, because there's something to look forward to, because spiral dynamics is this fascinating way of understanding human development. And as things go forward, my plan is to continue to post a video most weekdays. If you're not subscribed to the newsletter, I run a newsletter called The Other Side of Complexity. I send something out every weekend. It's usually got a couple pieces of media that have piqued my interest across the week or throughout the week, and usually involving some kind of dialogue or something that's like brilliant, you should see this, and some music that I've been entertained by in the past week. And the music for this week is like really good. All right. Until next time.